Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage.
Hey guys, I'm back again. Just felt like doing another video. Reminder, I'm putting these videos on a different channel, and I'm gonna once again put the link up in my description section here. G Lee is the name of the channel, though you're best going to it from the link, because there's a whole bunch of G Lees that come up if you just enter the name in a YouTube search. So that's where I'm going to be putting all of my future in-person videos anyway. And thanks to the folks that already subscribed to them just from my last video. So a small batch of people, a handful of people, already went there and subscribed to that channel, which is great because I really need to get it to 1,000 subscribers, which is going to take a long time. But I started with 17, so I think I have about I got about another half dozen. So slowly but surely, I hope I get there. So I'm just going to do a random vinyl pull again, and let's see if I have any stories with these albums. Okay. Yeah. Okay. Wow. Okay. Here's it's not an ECM album. Here's an album, interestingly enough, that I only have on vinyl, and the Modern Jazz Quartet. This is one of my favorite Modern Jazz Quartet. I'm quite a fan of theirs. Modern Jazz Quartet with Laurindo Almeida, the classical guitarist. He played in a jazz context, but he always played nylon string, much like Charlie Byrd, who actually, I pulled out a Charlie Byrd album last go-round. So over the years, the Modern Jazz Quartet did only really a few collaborative albums where they brought in another musician. One of them was Sonny Rollins. It was essentially a live gig, and they issued that on an album. Sonny Rollins playing just a handful of songs with the MJQ. But if you're familiar with the Modern Jazz Quartet sound, drums, upright bass, vibraphone, and piano, they made a lot of albums with just that, that specific lineup. So once you absorb some of their classic albums with that lineup, I think it's always interesting to hear them in playing with somebody that's another musician, whether it's a soloist like a Sonny Rollins or somebody like Laurindo Almeida, who I have solo albums by Laurindo. I think he's passed away a while ago now. Where did he come from? I'm not sure, but I know he basically pooled everything to come to the U.S. to have a career. Ended up on the West Coast. And I want to see if there is a... It looks like the date on here is 1966, so I'm thinking that's when the album probably came out. It was probably recorded shortly before that. John Lewis on piano, in case you don't know, the great John Lewis. Milt Jackson on vibraphone, Percy Heath on bass, Connie Kay on drums. And Laurindo Almeida on guitar. And they do Antonio Carlos Jobim's One Note Samba. They do Concerto de Aranjuez on here, the Rodrigo track, which is just natural when you've got a classical guitarist in there. The MJQ was a band, I think, that was popular among people that were into more conservative jazz, but it really kind of undersells their talent. John Lewis, the pianist, and really was the main band leader and the main composer of the group. Milt Jackson wrote for the group also. Most of Milt Jackson's stuff was still based on the blues, and it was John Lewis's piano and his writing that kind of looked more toward what was called third stream, which definitely bore the fruit of his love for classical music. and he integrated that into the jazz world. Almost like a precursor to, you know, in a way, what a lot of the ECM artists would go on to do in the 70s. And, you know, a lot of their music, as a matter of fact, one of the albums I have by them called No Sun in Venice, which is a great album, is quite simply the quietest album of any type of music I have ever bought. I originally bought it on vinyl, and it was like, it was quiet music that was recorded at a low volume, and I've never had an album where I had to crank the volume up so much just to get it to be listenable, just so you could hear what was going on. Now, a couple years ago, I'm like, oh my God, I got to get this on CD. I kind of forgot about this album, and the CD was out of print. And I found a place that claimed they had some copies, and I was kind of overpaying for it. And but I put the order in anyway. And after several weeks, the order got canceled, so they didn't really have it in stock. And I guess the company that had it up on their website didn't even realize it was out of print, and they couldn't get copies anymore. I think I have to look. I think it may have come back in print. But this is, you know, in a way, the MJQ has kind of gone the way of like the Dave Brubeck Quartet, where they were a band that were appreciated, I think, in a slightly larger way than a lot of mainstream jazz groups were. And it's fairly conservative jazz, so it gets I don't want to say a bad reputation, but people tend to shy away from it now. And it's subtle stuff indeed, and maybe, you know, if you don't take into account when their albums were recorded, I think you miss how innovative they were. And it seems like, you know, the people that do the wild stuff, like the free jazz stuff and all that, or, you know, the guys that are heavier and louder, get a lot more credit for innovations than the guys that are kind of on the quiet, low-key side. And when did I get into the MJQ? Well, I got into the MJQ in the late 70s. And, you know, whenever I pull out one of their albums and listen to them or anything, you know, unfortunately, one of the first things that comes to mind is, wow, all four guys in the group, when I got into them, were still alive and around and performing, not just as a group. They were still making solo albums as well and doing a lot of appearances. And, you know, one by one, they passed away. I'm pretty sure drummer Connie Kay, who was not the original drummer, but he joined the band within a couple years of the group forming. Connie Kay passed away first, and then I believe it was Milt Jackson, and I could be wrong about Percy Heath, and John Lewis was last. I believe John Lewis was the most recent that had passed away. I was very sad at that. It's weird. There's a whole lot of artists that I got into at the very end of their long careers, but it still, you know, makes me feel old. You know, here I am. The MJQ was not a new group in the late 70s when I got into them, but they were still all, you know, around with the four core members, three of them original members. Connie Kay being the drummer that joined just a couple years after the band started. You know, once again, like the Great Guitars, you know, I saw them on a PBS channel. The Great Guitars, Herb Ellis, Charlie Bird, and Barney Kessel. And when I saw a PBS concert of them in the late 70s, they were still, it was a recent concert, they were still very active. Still touring, even though they weren't young guys at that point. And, you know, now, I went out and I bought solo albums by all three guys, you know, and now they're all gone. And it's kind of sad. And unfortunately, I didn't even find out about John Lewis's passing until, you know, once again, quite a while after the fact. You know, it's not going to get, sadly, reported in the news at all. And sometimes I don't know why. You know, I guess I don't look everybody up, every single person up that I'm into on the internet to see if they're still alive. I guess on a monthly basis, you'd almost have to. But so I miss John Lewis, but I found out probably a couple years after his passing, and it was quite sad. They put out a really good live set on CD. I think it had been recorded in the early 60s, I want to say. And it was a concert somewhere in Europe, I believe. I'll have to find it. And it was never released, but John Lewis had, I guess, reel-to-reel tapes in his house of the concert. And it was shortly after Connie Kay, their drummer, passed away, that John Lewis found these tapes in his home, in his own home, and put them on and played them and said, wow, these are really good. And they released it as an album called Dedicated to Connie. And when you hear it, the audio quality is really excellent for the time, at least as good as anything they put out during that time frame, whenever it was that it was recorded. I want to say that this 1960s. So John was very much keeping the torch alive as long as he was around of the MJQ and its music, and who knows what other tapes might have been in his house that we'll never get to hear now because he's gone. But this is one that I really do want to get. I gotta pick up the CD of that. If you get a chance, look up the MJQ, Modern Jazz Quartet, on YouTube. You have to be in the mood for some fairly low-key jazz, But if you could really get into the subtlety and the beauty of their music, I think there's a lot of people that could appreciate it. Let me just pick another one. Well, I'd pick an ECM. Ring, the Gary Burton Quartet with Eberhard Weber. This is interesting because, I bought this. I was well into ECM by the time I picked this up. I was an Eberhard Weber fan. I would have picked it up even if he didn't appear on it. But it's quite interesting for being an album that has two bass players on it, Eberhard Weber and Steve Swallow both. And they toured together. There was an interview I read, this was a print interview with Eberhard Weber, where he talked about touring with the Gary Burton Quartet. The quintet, which was a six-piece with him and two bass players. So Eberhard Weber actually did tours with Gary Burton here in America. I know because he spoke about America, touring here. And they worked out a thing live, because, when you're talking about jazz, you're talking about a lot of improvisation. When you have two bass players, it's hard not to step on each other's feet. And they had this whole thing worked out between Eberhard Weber and Steve Swallow. I guess piece by piece of who would play what, where on the neck of the basses that they played, so that they wouldn't be in the same range at the same time and not just cancel each other out, but clash. So this was one of those albums that seems to be rated much higher than many others of the Gary Burton ECM era. And to me, it's a good album. But they did another one called Passengers with close to the same lineup, which I actually much prefer to this album. And it's interesting because of the 4 or 6 pieces on here, they do a completely different rearranged versions of The Color of Chloe by Eberhard Weber, which was a composition from his first solo album. They do a Carla Blake tune, and I don't know, did Gary Burton ever record an ECM album that he didn't have some Carla Blake music on? And oddly enough, 3 Mike Gibbs tracks. So Gary Burton was apparently quite a fan of Mike Gibbs' compositions. And 1 track by guitarist Mick Goodrick. Now, in addition to Gary Burton on vibraphone, you've got Mick Goodrick and Pat Metheny both on guitars. So you got 2 guitarists, 2 bassists, Bob Moses on drums, and Gary Burton on vibraphone. So it's an interesting sound, with the 2 guitars, 2 basses, the vibes in there, no horns or anything like that. And I do, this is from 1974. This goes back a long way. I was in high school. So this goes back a long ways. It's a good album. It's not at the top of my favorites list. I like Passengers better. I like the Carla Bley album that I showed, that I think I randomly pulled out. But for a lot of people, they rank this as absolute top of the heap of the ECM albums. I'm going to pull another one. I can tell by the cover I pulled another ECM album. Sorry, guys. John Sermon. I bought this as a new release. I remember picking this up at Disco Mat. John Sermon, Such Winters of Memory. An album, not a solo album, but an album, very interestingly, with Pierre Farver on drums and Karen Krogh on voice. She also plays tambura and messes around with the Oberheim ring modulator, which is a thing that altered sound. So I'm guessing she probably has the ring modulator on her voice, which would create some eerie sounds. John Sermon, of course, playing various saxophones, a bass clarinet recorder. I always like hearing his recorder work. Piano. He doesn't play piano on many of his solo albums, and does synthesizer as well, and some voice, which you don't hear a whole lot of. Recorded December 1982. I remember buying this when it came out because I was there's Karen Krogh and Pierre Farver, the drummer. That's not coming out, is it? Typically stark, bleak, kind of beautiful cover photograph. This is one of my favorite John Sermons. When it comes to John Sermon music, I am a hardcore fan nut for his all solo albums. He's got a lot of them now, but those are my first to gets on the John Sermon list. And actually the only one I don't currently have is one called Westering Home, which was a solo album where Sermon played all the instruments himself, that he recorded before he went to ECM Records, so it's not actually on ECM Records, but it is up here on YouTube. There's just something about the sparseness I like of Sermon's all solo albums. You know, sometimes you'll have just a solo horn playing a piece or a section of a piece, and other times there's many horn overdubs, and there's so much going on. Plus, it's pretty much only with his solo albums where he doesn't have a group that he plays synthesizer on, and pretty much doesn't mess with it when he's playing with, say, a quartet, you know, with a piano player, bass and drums kind of thing. And I always like his synthesizer textures. Now, on this one, this is next to his solo albums, this is my very favorite thing, because it's almost like a solo album with a couple additional musicians instead of a group, simply because, you know, it's not set up in a standard, we got a bass player and drummer, so we have a rhythm section and a piano kind of thing. You know, Pierre Farver's drums are there, and his, you know, percussion, but it's not kind of always playing the standard beat like you would expect. And, you know, the third musician is the voice of Karen Krogh, who actually, I see that John Sermon recorded a lot with over the years, but not on ECM. So over the years, John Sermon and Karen Krogh have had this kind of ongoing musical relationship. And yet, I think this is the only time that they recorded together on ECM, and making it also the easiest of their collaborations to pick up on. So this is more like a John Sermon thing with Karen Krogh's voice in there and Pierre Farver playing percussion, but it's not set up like a group. Like the percussion isn't really like, there's a rhythm section there, and John Sermon's like playing like a bass line on a bass saxophone or something like that. You don't know what to expect going into it. It's such a great journey. You know, this is again, you know, I pull these albums out, and I haven't played this for, I don't know, a while. I think I played it within the last year. Of course, I have it on CD. But it's just one of those ones that is such a unique album because of the musical lineup. Very, you know, in a way similar to Bar Phillips' Journal Violin 2, which is a similar trio with John Sermon on saxophones, Bar Phillips on bass, and Ina Kemenos on vocals, and no percussion whatsoever. but that's also got this kind of sparse, unusual lineup, and you've got the voice there doing, these things with, a voice without lyrics for the most part, so it's essentially almost playing the role of like a flute would, because these are higher female voices, so the voice takes on a different quality, almost like it would be a wind instrument. But I love the sparseness of it, and maybe it's just because of the titles and the suggestion of winter, but it really does sound like winter. And I tend to listen to this in winter, but now since I've randomly pulled it out, I'm gonna pull it out again. This would be a really good one for folks to be able to sample. I'm gonna assume that maybe there's some individual tracks from this on YouTube for people to sample to decide if it's their kind of thing, because it's a little bit more, maybe slightly more avant-garde than John's completely solo albums, simply because of the uniqueness of Karen Croag's voice and the processing of her voice and kind of the unusual instrumental combination. I wouldn't mind if these guys got together and did another one like this, but this is 1982, so it's quite a long time ago. I remember seeing this, buying this when it came out. I'm going to guess when it was recorded, December 82, so it would have come out in 83. Probably mid to late 83. I would have been right there because I was a fan already at that point. Okay. Oh, wow. Should I pull another one or should I keep it short? I think I'm going to keep this one real short and just do another one. Do another one real soon. So, thanks for those folks that subscribe to my other channel. I'm putting up a link again for my other channel where these videos will be in the future. And thanks for anybody that watches. I appreciate it and hope everybody's doing well. I'll be back real soon. Bye-bye.
Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.